Thank you, Chair Brown, and thanks so much to our panelists. And I actually appreciate the questions that Senator Scott is asking, and maybe I'll follow up on this a little bit with just tilted a little bit more towards the CRA. So we all know, of course, that COVID has not been the great equalizer. We've seen it has hit hardest those that are already struggling with the inequities in our country. Including frontline workers and elders and Black and brown and indigenous communities of color. I read a number today that I thought demonstrates this and was so surprising to me. The National Bureau of Economic Research says that since the start of the pandemic, the number of Black business owners dropped by 41%, compared to a 17% decline for white business owners. So clearly we need to take intentional steps to address this challenge. So I'm glad to see the OCC and the FDIC and the Fed are all coming together, committed to working jointly on a CRA final rule. And I want to just ask you, Mr. Su, if you could talk to us a little bit about how the CRA can be strengthened to specifically help address this gap in minority business ownership that we see in this data.
Okay, so one thing I've learned is that the CRA is a complicated rule. So I think there are many things that we can do. We currently have groups that are working pretty much around the clock on coming up with options to strengthen the CRA to make sure that low and moderate income communities have their needs met. There are a lot of I'm happy to have further briefings with you, kind of walk through some of those details. I have found the complexity to be both interesting, and I think this is why on an interagency basis it's so important that we do this together, so there's clarity and consistency in how it's done, and so that banks and community groups have those needs met.
Thank you. And I'm going to, Ms. McWilliams, I'm going to come back to you in this. I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper on something here. Earlier this year in May, I chaired a subcommittee hearing focused on the housing needs of Native Americans, and we saw here in this committee that one of the major barriers to accessing affordable home ownership and housing in general on tribal lands is the lack of lending on tribal lands. There's, of course, a lot of complexity about lending on tribal lands, and bank and credit institutions have many fewer branches on tribal lands, leading to a high percentage of unbanked households in these communities. According to a 2016 report commissioned by Treasury, CRA funds are rarely directed to Native communities, even though Native CDFIs would meet the CRA criteria. So could you comment on this and what more we could do in this area? And I'd love to hear from both Mr. Su and also Ms. McWilliams. Mr. Su, would you like to go first?
Sure. So there have been some studies indicating that CRA requirements have slowed the debranching, if you will, in certain areas. So I think that is an interesting factor that's being taken into account as the teams are kind of working through how to strengthen and modernize the CRA. Branching is very, very important. There was an interesting meeting that we've had. We've been meeting with lots of different groups, and there was the head of a bank that serves those populations, and noted that it's a blend. Branches are necessary, but also digital, because of the geographic distances involved with those communities. Improving kind of digital technology is also equally important. So we were trying to find ways to meet all of the needs of those communities through all the different options.
Thank you. Ms. McWilliams?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. Frankly, it's something that I have taken to heart. And in large part because I had an opportunity to drive through a number of Native American lands throughout the United States and saw the communities and the economic impact in those communities. And I did so actually during the pandemic, which was staggering in many cases. I believe that the CRA can be a great equalizer here. We can assign different formulas for investments in Native American businesses, in minority businesses in general, in MDIs that are Native American. We have worked extensively to make sure that they can sustain themselves and support their communities. I believe that the Mission-Driven Bank Fund that we're setting up is going to be an opportunity to to, I would say, be a great equalizer in this space, and we hope to solicit and be able to get even more investments in the fund so that there's more capital to be distributed. We call it patient capital because the point is not the return on the capital, the point is the impact of the capital in the communities.
Right.
And we want to make sure that that gets compounded and magnified through different investments. And we have also done a public relations campaign on the origin story about what MDIs, including Native American MDIs, do in their communities. I think people quite often forget that they are at the forefront of making sure those communities have access to credit. And given the, I would say, the rural nature of those communities, it's essential. It's absolutely essential for us as regulators to have utmost focus on this issue and to make sure there's funding, capital, credit, and investments flowing to those communities. So thank you for your support.
Thank you. Well, Senator Scott talks about invisible communities, people who have been, invisible when it comes to credit. This is clearly the case for many families living on tribal lands, and then you layer on top of that the complexity of lending when land is held in trust, and it exacerbates the housing crisis that we see on tribal lands. So thank you. I think this is something important for us to work on as we look towards these new CRA rules. Thank you.